The photograph arrived at the Denver History Museum in a dusty cardboard box, donated by the estate of Martha Caldwell, a rancher's widow from Colorado Springs. Among faded family portraits and yellowed documents, museum curator Dr. Sarah Mitchell found herself staring at a tintype that would soon unravel one of the darkest secrets of the American frontier. The image showed a lone cowboy standing beside his horse outside what appeared to be a trading post. Dated 1879 in careful script on the back, the photograph captured a man in his 30s with weathered features and a confident smile. He wore typical frontier attire, a wide-brimmed hat, leather chaps, and a gun belt around his waist. His eyes held a peculiar gleam, almost predatory in nature. There was something unsettling about his expression, Dr. Mitchell later recalled. Most frontier photographs from that era show stoic, serious faces. This man was smiling, but it wasn't a warm smile. It was the kind of smile that made you uncomfortable. The cowboy's hands rested casually on his belt buckle, and his posture suggested complete confidence. Behind him, the wooden facade of the building showed signs of the harsh western climate, with warped boards and sun-bleached paint. A few other figures could be seen in the background, but they were blurred and indistinct. What caught Dr. Mitchell's attention wasn't the cowboy's unsettling smile or his confident stance. As she examined the photograph more closely with a magnifying glass, she noticed something carved into his leather belt that shouldn't have been there. Something that would lead her down a path of discovery that would challenge everything historians thought they knew about justice on the American frontier. The investigation that followed would reveal a story of vigilante justice, mistaken identity, and a man whose smile hid the darkest of secrets. Dr. Mitchell adjusted the museum's high-powered magnifying equipment, focusing on the cowboy's belt. What she saw made her blood run cold. Carved into the leather, barely visible but unmistakably present, were small notches. Not decorative patterns or ranch brands, but deliberate marks that followed a specific pattern. At first, I thought they might be ownership marks or perhaps decorative tooling, Dr. Mitchell explained to her colleague, Dr. James Harrison, the museum's expert on frontier violence. But when I counted them, I found exactly 17 notches, each one identical in size and spacing. Dr. Harrison leaned over the photograph, his face growing grave. In frontier culture, notches on a gun or belt often represented kills. But 17. That would make this man one of the most prolific killers in the Old West. The discovery became more disturbing as they examined the notches more closely. Each mark appeared to be made with the same tool, suggesting they were carved over time, not all at once. The precision and uniformity indicated a methodical approach that sent chills down both historians' spines. Martha Caldwell's estate records provided the photograph's provenance. It had belonged to her great-grandmother, Eleanor Whitmore, who had lived in various frontier towns throughout Colorado and Wyoming during the 1870s and 1880s. A handwritten note tucked behind the photograph read, "Thomas, Cheyenne, 1879. May God forgive us all." The tone of that note was what convinced me we were dealing with something significant, Dr. Mitchell said. The phrase, "May God forgive us all," suggested that whoever wrote it was carrying tremendous guilt about this man named Thomas. The historians began to realize they weren't looking at a simple frontier portrait. They were staring at evidence of something far more sinister. The question that haunted them was simple yet terrifying. Who was Thomas, and what had he done to earn 17 notches on his belt? Dr. Mitchell and Dr. Harrison began their investigation by searching through the museum's extensive archives of frontier records. They focused on Cheyenne, Wyoming, in 1879, looking for any mention of a man named Thomas who might match their mysterious cowboy. Cheyenne in 1879 was a booming frontier town, fueled by the Transcontinental Railroad and cattle drives. It was also a place where violence was common and justice was often administered by vigilante committees rather than official law enforcement. The town had a reputation for being rough, even by frontier standards. What we found in the Cheyenne newspaper archives was deeply troubling, Dr. Harrison noted. The Wyoming Tribune from 1879 contained numerous reports of missing persons, unexplained disappearances, and unsolved murders. Between March and October of that year, at least 23 people had vanished without a trace. The disappearances followed a pattern that made the historians increasingly uncomfortable. The victims were primarily drifters, gamblers, and other transient members of society, people whose absence might not be immediately noticed or investigated. Most were found weeks or months later, if at all, in remote locations outside town. Local. Law enforcement records, preserved in the Wyoming State Archives, painted a picture of a community living in fear. Sheriff William Morrison had documented his frustration with the unsolved cases in his official reports. "These ain't random killings," he wrote in one dispatch to territorial authorities. "Someone is hunting people like animals." The breakthrough came when Dr. Mitchell found a letter in Eleanor Whitmore's personal papers, donated along with the photograph. Written in Eleanor's hand and dated November 1879, it was addressed to her sister in Denver. "I cannot sleep knowing what I know about Thomas Brennan. The committee thought they were doing right, but we may have made a terrible mistake. God help us. We may have helped a monster." The letter was signed with a shaking hand, and water stains suggested Eleanor had been crying when she wrote it. Armed with the name Thomas Brennan, the historians began piecing together the identity of the smiling cowboy. What they discovered painted a picture of a man who had moved through frontier towns like a shadow, leaving death in his wake. Thomas Brennan first appeared in historical records in 1876 in Dodge City, Kansas, where he worked briefly as a cattle hand. Employment records showed he was reliable and skilled with horses, but fellow workers described him as cold and unnatural friendly. More disturbing were the reports of missing persons during his time in Dodge City. 6 people vanished between May and August 1876. What made Brennan so dangerous was his ability to blend in, Dr. Mitchell explained. He appeared to be just another cowboy looking for work. People trusted him because he looked and acted the part perfectly. Brennan's trail led through several frontier towns: Abilene, Kansas, North Platte, Nebraska, and finally Cheyenne, Wyoming. In each location, the pattern was the same. He would arrive, find work, and within months, people would begin disappearing. The victims were always society's outcasts: prostitutes, gamblers, drifters, and alcoholics. A letter from a North Platte newspaper editor to his counterpart in Cheyenne, discovered in the Nebraska State Historical Society archives, provided chilling insight. "Be warned about Thomas Brennan. He is not what he seems. 3 families here mourn children who vanished while he was in town. He has a smile that reaches his eyes, but not his soul." The most damning evidence came from a journal kept by Father Miguel Santos, a Catholic priest who administered to the frontier communities. His entry from September 1879 was particularly disturbing. Thomas Brennan came to confession today. "I cannot repeat what he told me, but I have never heard such evil spoken so calmly. He shows no remorse, only pride in his terrible work. I fear for the souls of all who cross his path." Father Santos had tried to alert authorities, but frontier law enforcement was often overwhelmed and under-resourced. His warnings went unheeded. As the historians delved deeper into Eleanor Whitmore's papers, they uncovered evidence of something that would make their blood run cold: a secret vigilante committee that had been tracking Thomas Brennan across the frontier. Eleanor's diary, written in 1879, revealed that she had been part of a group of concerned citizens who had taken justice into their own hands. The committee consisted of prominent Cheyenne residents: Eleanor herself, who ran a boarding house; Samuel Pierce, a successful merchant; Dr. Edward Walsh, the town's physician; and Margaret O'Connor, who operated the telegraph office. "We knew the law couldn't protect us," Eleanor had written. "Sheriff Morrison was a good man, but he was outnumbered and outgunned. When we realized Thomas Brennan was the one responsible for the disappearances, we knew we had to act." The committee had been investigating the disappearances independently, comparing notes and tracking patterns. Margaret O'Connor's position at the telegraph office allowed her to communicate with other towns, confirming Brennan's movements and the trail of missing persons he left behind. Dr. Walsh's medical expertise proved crucial in examining the few bodies that had been found. His private notes, preserved in Eleanor's papers, described evidence of torture and mutilation that suggested the killer took pleasure in his victim's suffering. This is not the work of a man driven by passion or desperation, Dr. Walsh had written. This is systematic cruelty performed by someone who enjoys causing pain. The committee's plan was simple but dangerous. They would lure Brennan into a trap and execute him themselves. They knew that even if they could prove his guilt, the territorial justice system was too slow and unreliable to stop him before he killed again. Samuel Pierce had approached Brennan with an offer of work, claiming he needed an experienced cowboy to help move cattle to a remote pasture. The isolated location would give them the opportunity to confront him without witnesses. God forgive us, Eleanor had written, but we convinced ourselves we were doing his work. Eleanor's diary provided a detailed account of the committee's plan to eliminate Thomas Brennan. What they discovered about the execution of their plan would reveal just how wrong they had been about everything. On October 15, 1879, Samuel Pierce led Brennan to a remote canyon 20 miles outside Cheyenne, supposedly to examine cattle that needed to be moved. The other committee members were hidden among the rocks, armed and ready to carry out their vigilante justice. Thomas seemed completely at ease, Eleanor had written. He joked with Samuel about the weather and asked about payment for the job. There was no hint of suspicion in his manner. Looking back, that should have warned us. Dr. Walsh had positioned himself with a rifle on the canyon rim, while Eleanor and Margaret O'Connor waited with horses at the canyon mouth to prevent escape. The plan was for Pierce to confront Brennan with evidence of his crimes, and if he confessed or attempted to flee, they would execute him on the spot. But when the confrontation began, nothing went according to plan. Pierce accused Brennan of the murders, presenting evidence the committee had gathered. Brennan's reaction was not what they expected. He didn't deny it, Eleanor wrote. He laughed. He actually laughed and asked Samuel how long they had known. Then he said something that chilled us to the bone. You think 17 is all? You people are more foolish than I imagined. Brennan then revealed that he knew about the committee's investigation all along. He had been watching them, studying their movements, and planning his own trap. The isolated canyon wasn't just a place for the committee to confront him. It was where he had planned to kill them all. He drew his gun faster than any of us could react, Eleanor recorded. Poor Samuel never had a chance, but then something happened that none of us expected. The photograph that started the investigation had been taken just hours before this. Confrontation, by a traveling photographer who had been documenting life in frontier towns. What happened next in that remote canyon would haunt the surviving committee members for the rest of their lives, and the truth Dr. Mitchell uncovered was more horrifying than anyone could have imagined. Eleanor's diary revealed that as Brennan drew his weapon to kill Samuel Pierce, Dr. Walsh fired from his position on the canyon rim. The shot struck Brennan in the chest, and he fell backward against the canyon wall. But he was still alive, still conscious, and still smiling. We approached him carefully, Eleanor had written. He was dying, but he seemed almost pleased about it. That's when he told us the truth, and we realized the magnitude of our mistake. Thomas Brennan, as he lay dying, confessed to the murders, but not in the way the committee expected. He revealed that the 17 notches on his belt didn't represent his victims. They represented the real killers he had hunted down and eliminated. He was a bounty hunter, Dr. Mitchell explained to Dr. Harrison as they read through Eleanor's account, but not the kind who brought people back alive. He specialized in tracking down murderers who had escaped justice. Brennan had spent years following the trail of a serial killer who had been moving through frontier towns, killing vulnerable people. The real killer was someone the committee knew and trusted, someone who had been manipulating them from the beginning. The missing persons, the bodies, the evidence. It was all the work of one man, Eleanor had written, and we had been helping him by investigating Thomas Brennan instead of looking closer to home. As Brennan died in that canyon, he managed to whisper the name of the real killer. Eleanor's diary entry became nearly illegible at this point, the handwriting shaky and desperate. God help us all. It was Dr. Walsh. The man we trusted to help us was the monster we were hunting. Dr. Edward Walsh, the committee member who had fired the shot that killed Brennan, was the serial killer they had been trying to stop. and he had just eliminated the only man who could have exposed him. The revelation about Dr. Edward Walsh sent shockwaves through Dr. Mitchell's investigation. As she and Dr. Harrison dug deeper into the historical records, they uncovered evidence of a decades-long killing spree that had been hidden in plain sight. Eleanor's diary described the horrifying moment when the committee realized they had been manipulated by the very man they trusted most. Dr. Walsh had been present at the examination of every body found outside Cheyenne. He had been the one to determine causes of death, and he had systematically covered up evidence that might have pointed to a single killer. Walsh used his medical expertise to deflect suspicion, Dr. Mitchell noted. He would attribute deaths to wild animals, accidents, or random violence. No one questioned the town doctor's professional judgment. The historians found corroborating evidence in medical records from Walsh's practice. His patient files, preserved in the Colorado Medical Society archives, showed an unusual pattern. Many of his patients were the same type of vulnerable individuals who had been disappearing from frontier towns. A letter from a Denver physician to a colleague in Cheyenne, dated 1878, raised questions about Walsh's methods. I must express concern about Dr. Walsh's treatment protocols. Several patients referred to him for routine care have subsequently vanished. While this may be coincidence, I feel compelled to document my unease. Eleanor's diary revealed that after Brennan's death, the committee began to piece together Walsh's deception. Margaret O'Connor discovered telegraph records showing that Walsh had been secretly communicating with law enforcement in other towns, always offering to help with medical examinations of victims that matched the pattern of his own killings. He wasn't just killing randomly, Dr. Harrison observed. He was following a circuit, like a traveling salesman of death. He would stay in each town long enough to establish trust, kill several people, then move on before suspicion could settle on him. The most chilling discovery was a coded journal found among Walsh's effects after his death. Written in medical Latin to disguise its contents, it detailed his methodology, his selection criteria for victims, and his satisfaction with each killing. Samuel, Pierce's widow, had preserved one final piece of evidence that confirmed their worst fears. What Eleanor Whitmore and the surviving committee members did next revealed the moral complexity of frontier justice and the lengths people would go to protect their community's reputation. Eleanor's diary entries from late October 1879 showed a group of people struggling with an impossible decision. They had killed Thomas Brennan, an innocent man who had been trying to stop the real killer. Dr. Walsh had witnessed this act and used it to ensure their silence about his own crimes. Walsh made it clear that if we exposed him, he would ensure we all hanged for murdering Brennan, Eleanor had written. He had evidence of our conspiracy, our planning, our execution of an innocent man. We were trapped by our own vigilante justice. But the committee members couldn't live with the knowledge that Walsh was continuing to kill. Margaret O'Connor discovered through her telegraph communications that the disappearances had resumed in other towns where Walsh claimed to be visiting for medical conferences. The solution they devised was both clever and tragic. They decided to stage Walsh's death and create evidence that would expose his crimes without implicating themselves in Brennan's murder. Samuel Pierce's widow Martha played a crucial role in this plan. She had secretly observed Walsh's behavior and discovered where he kept his victims' personal effects as trophies. Using this information, the committee arranged for these items to be discovered after Walsh's supposed accidental death. We couldn't bring Thomas Brennan back, Eleanor had written, but we could ensure that no one else would die by Walsh's hand and that the truth about the real killer would eventually be known. On November 3, 1879, Dr. Edward Walsh was found dead in his clinic, apparently killed by a horse that had broken free from its hitching post and kicked him in the head. The accident was investigated by Sheriff Morrison, who discovered a hidden room in Walsh's clinic containing personal items from missing persons throughout the territory. The evidence was overwhelming, and Walsh was posthumously identified as the serial killer who had terrorized frontier communities for years. Dr. Mitchell's investigation into the 1879 photograph had uncovered a story of justice, revenge, and moral complexity that resonated deeply with contemporary understanding of Frontier life. The smiling cowboy in the tintype wasn't a killer. He was a hunter of killers, and his death had been a tragic case of mistaken identity. The historians published their findings in the Journal of Western History, finally clearing Thomas Brennan's name 145 years after his death. The article detailed how a group of well-intentioned citizens had been manipulated by the very monster they were trying to stop, and how they had ultimately found a way to achieve justice despite their terrible mistake. This case illustrates the moral ambiguity of frontier justice, Dr. Mitchell wrote in her conclusion. When legal institutions were weak or absent, ordinary people were forced to make extraordinary decisions. Sometimes they were right, sometimes they were wrong, but they were always human. Eleanor Whitmore's diary had one final entry, dated Christmas Day, 1879. I have written to Thomas Brennan's family in Kansas telling them he died a hero's death stopping rustlers. It is not the whole truth, but it is a kinder truth than they need to bear. I pray that God will forgive us our mistakes and remember our intentions. The photograph itself now hangs in the Denver History Museum with a new placard that tells Thomas Brennan's true story. Visitors often pause before it, studying the face of a man who dedicated his life to hunting monsters, only to be killed by the very people he was trying to protect. The 17 notches carved into his belt remain visible under magnification, each one representing a killer brought to justice by a man whose smile, once thought sinister, now seems tinged with the satisfaction of a job well done. Thomas Brennan had been hunting Dr. Edward Walsh for 2 years when he arrived in Cheyenne. He died just hours before he would have finally confronted his quarry. In death, Thomas Brennan achieved his goal. Dr. Walsh's killing spree ended, and the truth, though delayed by nearly a century and a half, finally emerged.